Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the channel, and I'm back to continue my Friday the 13th franchise review. I just did a review on Friday the 13th, Part 4, the final chapter. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. The movie I'm going to be reviewing is Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning, that came out 1 year later after the final chapter. Now, straight up, this movie has the Friday the 13th fan base heavily divided and has been for decades. This movie has been called very, very misleading because a lot of people, and even in 1985, had no idea that they were going to continue the Friday the 13th films despite the final chapter was clearly stated to be the end of Jason Voorhees and not the Friday the 13th film name. So this movie takes place sometime after the events of Part 4. Tommy Jarvis is making his way to a halfway house, and he apparently has had a tough upbringing ever since the events of Part 4 and his encounter with Jason. Tommy is basically played by John Shepard, and he's a loner in this. He's got really no friends. He's put into a halfway house that's basically seeing a bunch of people that are mentally affected as well. And Tommy ends up meeting a young boy named Reggie, and apparently he gets himself into trouble quite a bit with playing pranks on Tommy, trying to scare him. And he's kind of like the child version of what Tommy was in Part 4 with the mask and the tricks and stuff like that. Um, but Tommy Jarvis in this, he is heavily affected by what happened. He hallucinates and sees Jason almost all the time. And of course, after the death of somebody that actually had been killed by another patient there, this soon sparks up a series of murders that start happening. And Tommy is already realizing the possibility that Jason Voorhees is back. And in this film, we're basically put into this similar thing with the previous films where people are getting killed. And Tommy finally comes face to face to believing it's Jason for the very first time that he hasn't seen since he was a kid, when in reality it was not Jason at all under the mask, and it was actually a paramedic named Roy, who actually is the father of a son that was killed earlier in the movie. The guy that got killed by the other guy over a candy bar who had an axe and he was cutting wood, and he just came at the guy and killed him instantly with an axe. Um, this movie was very, very hard for me to watch when I saw it years later as a teenager when I got into horror films. I was told repeatedly by people that wanted me to see these movies to skip over Part 5. I had a hard time really understanding if I really liked Part 5 or if I've hated it. Let's be honest, this movie, it did have a very big body count, but a lot of it was really toned down gore and effects, and the music was kind of recreated. They don't use any of the Harry Manfredini music from part one, two, three, and four. This is completely new generic music. Um, I did not like the main theme to this movie. I just thought it was so generic and poorly created. I also did not like the end of the movie when we learned that it was actually a copycat killer dressed as Jason. Despite nobody even knew who Roy really was, nobody cared about him. But what they were doing, they were copying the logic off of him losing his son, almost him going insane the same way that Pamela Voorhees went when she thought she lost her son Jason when he drowned in Camp Crystal Lake. This movie also really has the believability that someone could take that much punishment, get stabbed, get run over by a Kubota tractor, get their hand cut off, and still keep coming. The way that Jason, that we were led to believe was him in this movie, just by looking at him, I kind of think that we knew that something was really off because Jason is not this skinny guy in a jumpsuit. He's actually a big, bulky killer, and he didn't have the usual markings on him from the previous films after taking damage. And I think off of seeing the killer for the very first time when he busted through the door and he went after Pam and Reggie, that just by looking at him, I mean, anybody could tell that it wasn't Jason under the mask. And the mask was different. It had the blue greenish like logos right here. It didn't have the red logo. We do see Jason in this movie. I mean, he is in hallucinations. He's in the beginning of the movie when Corey Feldman actually reprised the role of Tommy just for a brief cameo. Um, he sees these two guys digging up Jason's grave in the woods, and he comes to, kills the two guys. He walks up to Tommy, and Tommy's like, no, and Jason just went right down on him, and of course he wakes up and he's on his way to a halfway house. The reason Corey Feldman was not able to actually be in this movie full time is because he was still filming Goonies, so they could not utilize him, so that's why they had to bring in another actor. John Shepard was actually brilliant in the role of Tommy Jarvis in this movie. He was unhinged, he was unbalanced. The scene where Junior had tried to scare him at one point and he starts getting hostile towards Tommy and Tommy beat the crap out of him instantly in a matter of a minute. I mean, he was really an annoying character, Junior. He just rode around on a bike, and his mother was obviously nuts. She was chopping up meat. She always had this instinct about her that she wanted to violently react more to handle every problem, and she insulted her son. You know, you ain't so pretty yourself, you know. And Junior's like, I ain't so pretty myself, I know. And it's just, what was the whole point of that character? I mean, you know, it was just obviously just, I didn't like those characters. The halfway house setting was all right. It really didn't look like a halfway house. It looked like some, again, place with a bunch of cabins and people stay in. They also kind of didn't look like actual patients. They looked like they were just a group of disgruntled people that are not happy and they were rounded up together and put in the place. And, you know, this movie does not have a very good characterization. I also did not like the fact that they teased us at the end that this was to push Tommy Jarvis as the killer in part six, because Tommy actually does survive with Reggie and Pam. And there's the scene where Pam goes into the room after hearing a loud noise. She walks over and sees the hospital gurney that smashed into the window, and Tommy appears behind the door wearing the imposter Jason's mask, raises the knife, and then they just instantly roll credits. This was to be the film that would launch Tommy as the killer in part six, which I'm thankful they didn't do, um, because this movie got very horrible reviews. I think people crapped on it for many decades before finally really accepting it. I think this movie didn't really it didn't go over well to have a Jason survivor facing someone dressed up as Jason. It was just a bad concept. I get what they were doing. They wanted no more part of Jason Voorhees as the killer, so they wanted to move onward. And they learned, just like Halloween 3 Season of the Witch that tried to move on from Michael Myers, they learned that this was a bad idea. It was a stupid move. And they immediately scrapped plans to have Tommy as the killer in part six, which is a smart move. I think this movie was really below average. I didn't see anything likable about it. I found the characters to be somewhat generic. I didn't like the musical score. I didn't like the copycat killer logic. I do like John Shepard as Tommy as a secondary actor behind Tom Matthews, but I feel like in this movie again that he was also so much more emotionless at times rather than just someone who was affected by the trauma in his life that he had in part four. Um, the character of Reggie was just your typical Dennis the Menace. He was just someone who was constantly doing the hijinks and trying to cause trouble and stuff. I also really had a bit of a hard time that, again, the imposter Jason took so much punishment despite we knew it wasn't Jason. There's no way he could have taken that much punishment. Even though they were trying to make us believe it was Jason, it was not actually Jason under the mask. And there's no real way that anybody could have taken that punishment. And frankly, I feel Tommy Jarvis, even as nuts as he was, by looking at who he thought was Jason, I think he could have really easily detected it wasn't him under the mask, because there was no lasting marks. That he was completely dressed different, different mask. Clearly, this movie was an absolute failure with the whole logic of a copycat killer. I feel that it was not necessary. I think it failed. I think they learned from this movie and that it was a bad idea, even to mislead the fan base, because again, people did not know that this was to be the end of Jason in the previous movie, and people were like, "Why are they making more Friday the 13th?" And you know, this movie went over poorly. I mean, I don't think it did good. I don't think it really was a good movie. Is it the worst? I will say that for its time at the time for 1985, if we're going to compare this to the previous four films, this movie was a complete flop. But you guys might disagree. Tell me what you think in the comment section down below. Hit the subscribe button, guys. We're on the road to 100 subscribers. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I will talk to you later. Plenty more reviews to come. Take care.